which order. Okay, Professor Elizabeth DiSavino has had a wide and storied career in both music and academia, performing as part of numerous ensembles of both classical and folk musicians. She recently published Katherine Jackson French, Kentucky's Forgotten Ballad Collector, I say recently, last year, through the University Press of Kentucky, and a commemorative edition of Jackson French's ballads were published through Berea College, where she currently works as Associate Professor of Music. Professor DiSavino won the 2020 Kentucky History Award for the book, and she was recently featured on NPR's All Things Considered. Her talk today will be themed around this publication, giving us some insight into her research methods from what I've gathered. Yeah, over to you, Professor DiSavino.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you for having me. Thank you for having me back, since I apparently can't tell time. I was supposed to be here in December, and I totally mixed up the time differential. Anyway, I'm very glad to be here. I'm very glad to be speaking with you today, so thank you for having me. I thought I would start by just examining why I'm here, and how does my study of an obscure early 20th century Kentucky ballad collector tie into what your organization is about? Why is this relevant to your organization? So I went to your website, and I looked at your mission statement, and it's a wonderful mission statement that you're working to transcend periodization and genre and canon. And my research definitely wound up defying canon regarding Appalachian balladry. And for the purposes of our discussion, when we're talking ballads, we're talking those beautiful old ancient story songs that began in the British Isles and found a home over here in various places, including Southern Appalachia. There truly is a canon regarding balladry. There's basically two gods, okay? And thou shalt have no other gods before them. The first god is Francis Child, who compiled a massive collection over a period of nearly 20 years, a 10-volume set of English folk song, English and Scottish folk song, called the English and Scottish Popular Ballad, ballads, plural. And then the other god is Cecil Sharp, who compiled what became the de facto Bible of Appalachian balladry, English folk songs from the Southern Appalachians, first published in 1917. It is important to note that in both of these canons, the works were defined by outsiders. So think about that for a second. Francis Child was not English, he was an American, and he defined what British folk song was. Cecil Sharp was not an Appalachian, he was an Englishman, and he defined what Appalachian ballads were. And this is a particularly important thing to remember when speaking about Appalachia, because Appalachia, by and large, from its inception as a region, has been defined by outsiders. And it's only recently that Appalachian writers and musicians have begun to give an alternate view of what the region is like. So this is something to keep in mind, that both of these gods were actually people from the outside looking in. At any rate, the ballad collection of Katherine Jackson French goes to defy the canon of Cecil Sharp in several ways. She very briefly went into the mountains of Kentucky in 1909. She collected ballads in Eastern Kentucky all throughout the region, and she attempted to publish, but she was not able to. That's the very nutshell version of the story. I'll tell you more about that in a little bit. What does this have to do with popular culture? Well, one of the things that is pointed out on your site is that something can be popular one day and become alternative over a period of time. And that's certainly true of ballads, at least in my country. There really isn't a living ballad tradition anymore to a large degree. You may find a couple of families that are still passing them down, but for the most part, it's a reconstructed art. People go and sit at the knees of the last generation to have learned it through their families, and people go to archival collections and study those recordings. So it is an art of reproduction at this time rather than truly a living folk tradition in my country. So I wanted to just preface that so I could kind of have a firm foothold in the justification for why I'm here today, because ballads are by no means what people think of when they think of popular culture these days. In fact, you say the word ballad in my country, people's eyes glaze over, So I just wanted to establish what this particular study has to do with why you all come to this organization. I also thought it might be interesting to share with you how I came to this study. So I have a short piece that I wrote about that process, and I wanted to share that with you. Y'all hear me okay? Volume's okay? Good? Okay, great. So here we go. I met Katherine Jackson French deep in the belly of the Hutchins Library Special Collection and Archives at Berea College in the winter of 2012. She wasn't there, of course. She died the year I was born, but I came to know her through what she had left behind. Such is the magic of words and music. I was working there on a fellowship study with my husband, comparing Northern and Southern Appalachian music, and suddenly, there she was, sleeping in a cold white box in the quick and competent hands of archivist Harry Rice. She was nothing more than article manuscripts, newspaper clippings, musical manuscripts, and a truncated and gap-filled biography then, just a hint of mystery and song. But that box, once opened, seemed to whisper, "Tell my story." So I did. But first I had to discover what that story was. The bare bones were already there, in that plain white box. Born in 1875 in the frontier town of London, Kentucky, an unusually good education for a late 19th century woman, a PhD in English from Columbia University in 1906, a ballad collecting trip to East Kentucky in 1909 with an attempt to publish with the help of Berea College in 1910. An amazing second act as a professor, American Association of University Women's state president, and Women's Department Club founder in Louisiana. But much was missing, and the more I looked, the more questions I had. Especially puzzling was the fact that Berea College president William Goodell Frost had promised to help her to publish her ballad collection in 1910, yet the publication never happened. It only seemed right that I should investigate that promise, and as a Berea College professor, deliver on it if possible. The old saw, "better late than never," comes to mind. So many questions were unanswered by that one white box. Why had she, a girl and one of 7 children, been singled out for higher education at the end of the 19th century? What led her to collect ballads? Most of all, why did William Goodell Frost promise to help her, but not deliver on that promise? And if she had published before Sharp, would our first crucial impression of Appalachian balladry and Appalachians themselves have been different? Spoiler alert, yes, it would have, both musically and regarding the role of women. And while she, like Sharp and others, was focused on the Englishness of Appalachian ballads, there were hints as to the diversity of the roots of Appalachian music sprinkled throughout her observations. My quest to find answers to the above included much of what researchers expect to do: pore over dusty parchments in libraries and historical associations, visit places associated with her, learn the songs she left behind, and construct timelines piecing together information about different stages of her life. But when I discovered French's granddaughter through the miracle of online genealogical tools, the story became real. Granddaughter Kay had an entire room full of diaries, writings, letters, and photographs. That shapeless voice that I had heard in the archives gained corporeality with each sentence Katherine Jackson French had written, each photograph that emerged, each letter written to her. Slowly, bit by bit, she became a fully developed figure, one who lived the sort of remarkable life that women in the early 1900s generally didn't have. My admiration for her grew, and while she, like all of us, was not a perfect being, I think she was pretty dang close. A remarkable example of kindness, intelligence, grace, determination, faith, and courage. The story is told in full in Katherine Jackson French, Kentucky's Forgotten Ballad Collector, published by University Press of Kentucky. The authorship journey has been a long and wonderful one for me, punctuated by long stretches of editorial tedium and stress and the death of my mother, who I so very much wish could have seen this, and sleepless nights and searches for that righteously perfect and magic combination of words, those fleeting symbols which, after all, only imperfectly impart meaning at best. I have wrestled with them to the best of my ability. I hope I have been triumphant in that regard. I'm especially proud that Katherine Jackson French's ballad collection, English-Scottish Ballads from the Hills of Kentucky, appears in print for the first time as the third part of the book, and best of all, Berea College agreed to publish that commemorative edition of Jackson's Ballads in fulfillment of our 110-year-old promise to her. I've also recorded Jackson's Ballads in a 2 CD set, the reason being some people don't read music and they might want to know what they sound like. And it's the first time that some of these ballads have been heard in over 100 years, at least these versions of these ballads. This trilogy marks the culmination of a 6-year project. It has been my honor to tell the story of this remarkable woman and to bring her music at last to the world. So having done that, I thought I'd dive in a little more detail into the story of Katherine Jackson French and how this ballad collection came to be and who some of the key players were and those crucial questions that I had when I began. So let me share my screen. Do you have the PowerPoint? Yes? Okay. Katherine Jackson French is somebody who really should be well known through the state of Kentucky. I mean, there should be streets named for her. There should be statues erected to her. But at least until I wrote this book, no one seemed to have heard of her. So I went through the basics. She was an early Appalachian ballad collector, collecting in 1909. She tried to publish what was, in essence, the first large scholarly collection of Appalachian ballads in 1910, with help from Berea College, but that did not come to pass. And so the questions I had, the two really burning ones, were these. Why was she never able to get her collection published? And second, if she had published, and if she had published 7 years before Cecil Sharp, would it have made any difference? Was her collection any different than Sharp's, either in the material or in the way that she presented it? Or was it pretty much the same? Well, I filled in some of the holes of Jackson's life. She was born 1875 in London, Kentucky, and this is what London looked like. You can see not much there, just, some brand new houses, some muddy streets, some farms. She's actually born just outside the town in Raccoon Springs. And her great-grandparents founded the town. And in fact, she had a very prestigious family history. Her ancestors came over the Boone Trace with Daniel Boone on both sides of her family. The Jacksons were settlers at Jamestown. So she was a first family of London. She was a first family of Kentucky, a first family of the South, and a first family of the United States. So I think she grew up with the sense that much was expected of her. Her father was a merchant, built a pretty big store in London, Kentucky for the time, which became the center of the town, and the whole town grew up around it. The London Brass Band and the London Opera Company were housed here, as well as a bunch of other things. So young Katherine grew up around music and in what passed for a center of culture in Kentucky at the time. William Jackson built a beautiful house for his family in London, and that is Katherine front and center, that little girl at about 5 years old. And that is the Jackson family. As I said, she had a remarkable education, which began with attending the Science Hill Female Academy outside of Louisville for her high school education. Here she is with her friends. They're being naughty. They're embroidering instead of studying. And that's about as naughty as they got in those days. Katherine was the fourth generation to attend Science Hill, so the McKee side of the family had long believed in educating women. And it's important to know that Science Hill was not a finishing school. Science Hill was a place where, by the time Katherine Jackson went there, and this fellow on the left had taken over, Wiley Tall Pointer, a curriculum had been put in place that if you completed this curriculum, you automatically could enroll in Wellesley College, one of the 7 sister schools. So it was a very serious preparatory school for girls. not a finishing school, not the norm for the time, certainly not the norm for the South. This is the interior of Science Hill. It's a rather grand place, no longer a school, but you can visit and see some of the facilities, and that is the grand atrium. It's important to know the teachers at Science Hill were graduates of Northern colleges. They were all women. Why is this important? Well, because there really weren't many colleges in the South where a woman could go for a serious education at that time. If you wanted a serious education and you were a woman, you had to go north. So that's what Katherine Jackson did. She earned 2 degrees from Ohio Wesleyan, a bachelor's, then a master's in English literature, and then she did something that very few women of her time did. She earned a PhD in 1906. Not just a PhD, but one in English literature from Columbia University, the second woman in the history of the college to do so. After graduation, she taught at Bryn Mawr, she taught at Mount Holyoke, she did postgraduate work at Yale. This was a very unusual woman for the time. But it was something that happened while she was at Columbia that led to an even more unusual accomplishment. While at Columbia, several of her friends told her about a lecture they had heard given by 2 visitors from Berea College. And the lecture was about British Isle ballads still being sung in the mountains of Kentucky. Well, Jackson had studied literary ballads, and she was fascinated by the idea that sung ballads were alive and well in her home state. So she determined right then that as soon as she could, she would go exploring. Well, that chance came in 1909 because her mother became ill, and as the dutiful daughter, she came home and tended her. After her mother recovered, she journeyed alone into the mountains of East Kentucky. Please understand that at this time, a woman traveling alone was not only not usual, but dangerous. You could be picked up and charged with prostitution, being of poor character just because you were not in the company of a man. So here she is, tootling off to the mountains of eastern Kentucky all by herself. Well, not quite all by herself. She had the sheer dumb luck to have as her traveling companion a lively 50-ish widow by the name of Lizane Napier, who upon meeting her in the wagon chose immediately to be her guide and intermediary. And this is really important because I really think that if Katherine Jackson had gone off by herself into the mountains of East Kentucky and, she knocked on doors and the doors opened, that if they had seen Katherine, the educated, well-dressed, well-heeled, well-to-do woman standing there, I don't know that they would have sung for her. But I think that the door opened and they saw Lizane, and Lizane uttered that magic phrase that I have heard many times since coming to Kentucky from the north, and that phrase is, "Oh, she's a really nice woman." In other words, she's okay, you can sing for her. And sing they did. By the time Jackson left the mountain, she had over 60 ballads. But the first place that they went was Lizane's sister. Now, it's important to know Lizane Napier was born a Begley. The Begleys were a prime ballad singing family. Lizane married into the Napier family. The Napiers were a prime ballad singing family. Her sister Marthy was not only a Begley, she married a Begley. So it was, the Begley home was ballad central, basically. And when they made their first stop, they went to Lizane's sister's house, to Marthy Begley's house. And this ballad on the bottom is in fact the first ballad that Katherine Jackson heard in the mountains. And she said she was almost overcome with the transport of the centuries. And with your indulgence, I'll sing that for you. It's important to know that in those days, people had time. And a 20-verse ballad was not unusual. People would learn them, people would sing them, people would share them. So I'm going to sing you this ballad that Katherine Jackson heard on her first trip into the mountains. Sweet William Ross one May morning dressed himself in blue. Oh, tell unto me that long, long love is between Lady Margaret and you. I know nothing about Lady Margaret's love. I know that you don't love me. Tomorrow morning, 'bout 10 o'clock, Lady Margaret, my bride, shall see. Lady Margaret was standing in her own hall door, combing back her hair, when what did she spy but sweet William and his bride, as they to the church drew nigh. She threw away her ivory comb, in silk bound up her hair. She stepped out of her own hall door, and never returned there. The day being gone and night coming on, when most all men were asleep, sweet William espied Lady Margaret's ghost, standing at his bride's feet. "Well, how do you like your bed?" she said. "Well, how do you like your sheet? How do you like that pretty fair girl that's lying in your arms asleep?" Very well, I like my bed. Much better I like my sheet, but best of all is that pretty fair girl that's standing at my bride's feet. The night being gone and day coming on, when most all men were awake, sweet William said he was pestered in his head by a dream he dreamed last night. Such dreams I do not like. Such dreams, they are not good. I dreamed that my hall was filled with wild swine, and my bride was swimming in blood. He called round him his merry men all. He counted them 1, 2, 3. He asked the leave of his own dear wife, if Lady Margaret he might go and see. "Go and see Lady Margaret now. Go and welcome her for me, for I know you love Lady Margaret much better than ever you did love me." Sweet William rode up to Lady Margaret's gate. He tingled so loud at the ring, there's none so ready as Margaret's 7th brother to rise and let him come in. "Is Lady Margaret in her kitchen?" said he. "Or is she in her hall? Or is she in her own dwelling room amongst the ladies all?" "She's neither in her kitchen," said he, "nor is she in her hall. Yonder she lies in a cold coffin sits by the side of the wall. Unfold, unfold those holland sheets that are made of linen so fine. Let me kiss once more those cold clay lips that oft have kissed mine. Unfold, unfold those holland sheets that are made of linen so fine. Tonight they shall hang over Lady Margaret's corpse, and tomorrow shall hang over mine. Lady Margaret, she died on yesterday, and I shall die tomorrow. Lady Margaret, she died for pure love's sake, and I shall die for sorrow. Lady Margaret was buried in the new churchyard. Sweet William was placed close by her, and out of her grave sprung a blood-red rose, and out of his a green briar. They grew and they grew to the high church tower. They could not grow any higher. There they tangled and tied into a bow knot for all true lovers to admire. Sweet William and Lady Margaret. Thank you. I thought it was important to at least sing one in full so that you get the sense, if you're not into old ballads, you get the sense of how they were storytelling vehicles and how they were very arresting storytelling vehicles that had, a lot of the elements of the great stories in them: love, betrayal, loss, grief, supernatural elements, They're also windows into the times. They're windows into class structures and structures of gender and power structures and all of these other things. They're really windows into the times in which they were written and altered and passed on. And they are really important historically for that point, but they're also just wonderful. Katherine Jackson said about these songs, they have lived because they were loved. And I think that's a good way of realizing why there are people who still really value these songs and learn them and do keep them alive. Well, Katherine was in the mountains for about 2 weeks, and she was toted around by Lysane Napier to 4 different counties. I'm trying to get back to the PowerPoint, but my little arrow seems to have absconded. Hello, where did you go? There we go. At any rate, when she left, Lysane and Katherine had grown to be quite good friends. And Lysane sang a song. She sang The True Lover's Farewell, which is a fairly common song. It's a song that has snippets of other songs, The Lass of Roch Royale and Robert Burns' My Love is Like a Red, Red Rose. It's a prototype for a number of other songs. But what was interesting to me about this was that it included a verse that I haven't found anyplace else, and I wonder if Lysane wrote it for her. So I'll just sing a couple verses because it's quite long, and I'll just do about 4 verses. It's The True Lover's Farewell. And I'm going to be playing the mountain dulcimer, the lap dulcimer. the state instrument of Kentucky. You know, you cross the state line and they say, "Welcome to Kentucky. Here's your dulcimer." So let's do a little of the True Lover's Farewell. The time draws near, my dearest dear, when you and I must part. But little do you know the grief of my poor aching heart. Lord, send that I might go with you, or you might tarry here. Your company is so charming, love, so charming to me. This is the verse. It makes me think when you are away that a day is 3 and an hour is 10. It makes me weep when I might sleep and say I've lost a friend. So fare you well, my own true love, so fare you well for a while. For I'm going away, but I'm coming back again, although it be 10,000 miles. That is the True Lover's Farewell. All right, so let me get the PowerPoint back for you. And I will take you now through the dramatic part of the story. What happened after she finished collecting? What happened when she tried to publish her work? So we'll go to here. We'll go to here. And can you see the PowerPoint? Somebody give me an oral yes or no, because I can't see you now.
Yep, we can see the PowerPoint.
Lovely, thank you. All right, so now what to do? She had over 60 ballads, which is a good many ballads, and a number of variants on those ballads. What could she do? Well, she wanted to publish. She was hoping to make her academic bones with this, you know, because if you're a woman, a PhD in English from Columbia and postdoctoral studies at Yale just isn't enough. So she wanted to publish. And she knew that she needed the imprimatur of a powerful man, given the gender structures and the social structures of the day, just as Olive Dame Campbell knew. That's why she approached Cecil Sharp in 1915. So what did Katherine do? Katherine Jackson French sought the help of Berea College president and definer of all things Appalachian, William Goodell Frost. Frost was a giant in Appalachia. He was president of Berea College. He literally was the definer of Appalachia. He hired a geologist to define Appalachia as stopping magically at the Pennsylvania state line and extending down into the North Georgia mountains. And he inherited a college that the original mission statement was interracial and coeducational education. Unfortunately, the Day Law was passed in 1901, which forbade interracial education at college. This was aimed specifically to put Berea out of business. And Frost, I think, was actually admirable. He came under fire on a number of accounts, but I think his behavior on this was really admirable. He took all of the African-American students already at Berea and had the college pay for their tuition at historically Black colleges. And then he had Berea fund and build 60 miles away, as required by law, an African-American college, the Lincoln Institute, outside of Louisville. They could not just keep the African-American students. The school would have been bankrupted in 10 days. So Frost actually acted in a very admirable way, I think. At any rate, Katherine Jackson French went to Berea in 1910. It was Frost's wife, Ella Marsh Frost, who hosted that visit. And she came back in March, met William Goodell Frost. He agreed to help her publish, huzzah, huzzah, and she left her ballad collection with him. But publication did not happen. Well, why does this matter? Well, if she had published this collection in 1910 as intended, it would have been the first large scholarly collection of Appalachian balladry ever published. But instead, several things colluded to destroy her dreams of publication. In the meantime, others like Hubert Sheeran and Cecil Sharp went on to claim the mantle of Appalachian ballad expert. Sharp in particular, who published English folk songs from the Southern Appalachians in 1917, became thought of as the singular expert on the subject. His book is The Bible of Appalachian Balladry, particularly the 1932 re-release, which is about twice the size of the original. And his material and his views on Appalachian balladry became unquestioned truth, and to a large degree remain so down to this day. So let's get back to those two crucial questions that were what drove this whole thing. Why was she never able to get this published? And two, if she had published, would it have made a difference? Was there anything different about her collection? Okay, let's take the second part first. Yes, there were a number of things different about her collection. In the first place, she highlighted the role of women to a very, very high degree, unlike Cecil Sharp. It's important to know that 2/3 of Cecil Sharp's informants for his English folk songs from the Southern Appalachian were women, and his prime informant, Jane Hicks Gentry, from whom he got over 60 ballads, was a woman. And yet, though he mentions Gentry in a paragraph with 3 other collectors, two male, 2 female, he does not mention that primarily it was the women who were keeping these songs alive. In fact, in his 23-page introduction, not once does he say, oh, and by the way, it's mostly women singing these songs. Instead, when he speaks about the ballad collector, he uses the male pronoun. For example, he writes, the wonderful charm, fascinating and well-nigh magical, which the folk singer produces upon those who are fortunate enough to hear him, is to be attributed very largely to his method of singing, and this, it should be understood, is quite as traditional as the song itself. The genuine folk singer is never conscious of his audience, indeed, as often as not, he has none, and he never has, etc. So, and it's important to realize also that the convention of the day was that if you're talking about men and women, you defaulted to the male pronoun. And I get that, but what's the picture we get? The picture we get is that of a male singer, not of a woman singer. Jackson, on the other hand, in a very short introduction, devoted almost 1/3 of that introduction to highlighting the role of women. Almost all of her sources were women. She stressed the fact that it was to the women of the community is the credit for preservation of the ballad due, and she dedicated her collection to the singing mothers of colonial America. Other differences, which I think had to do with the fact that it was women she was hearing singing and noticing how they related to each other, was that she painted a much more communal picture. I mean, people didn't go to hear a ballad singer. It was just part of life. And Elizane took her to sewing bees and to family gatherings, and people just sang. It was just as natural as breathing. She also describes the way they sang, and it's a little different than Sharp's definition, because she describes the singers as rocking in their chairs, rocking back and forth, almost like they're dovening. And she also says that the faces are expressive of the stanza sung. So that also is a difference to Sharp. There were some musical differences too, and I think these are important. So I'm going to turn off the PowerPoint. I'm not going to play for very long, but I am going to play a little bit to show you those differences. In the first place, most of, when you think of Appalachian balladry, what do you think of? You think of fiddle tunes, you think of breakdowns. Maybe you think of bluegrass, though that's not Appalachian, it's bluegrass. The bluegrass is not in the mountains. But what do you think of? You think of that driving backbeat, right? You think of that 1, 2, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. You think of this kind of rhythm. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and duple meter. 1 and 2 and. But the majority of Jackson's collection were not in duple meter. They were in triple meter. The majority of Sharp's collection were in duple meter. So what do I mean by triple meter? I mean, instead of 1 and 2, and it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Oh, where have you been to, Lord Randall, my son? Oh, where have you been to, my sweet pretty one? Over high hills and mountains, mother, make my bed soon, for I'm sick to the heart and I wanna lie down. Oh, what did you eat for your supper, Lord Randall, my son? What did you eat for your supper, my sweet pretty one? Fried eels and fresh butter, mother, make my bed soon, for I'm sick to the heart and I wanna lie down. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. You hear it? You hear the difference, right? Yeah. So most of hers were in triple meter. I think this is important because this idea of duple meter being predominant in Appalachian music starts with Sharp. It is cemented by the Carter family, and it's even more cemented by bluegrass. And yet there were a lot more apparently from Jackson's collection, we can say that at least in Kentucky, there were a great many triple meter songs being sung. So I think that's important because that goes against the stereotype again, that goes against the canon, right? Also, I'm going to get in trouble for this. Let me say first that I have a great deal of respect for Cecil Sharp. I think his collection is amazing. If he hadn't done it, yes, a lot of those songs would be lost now. And I'm not going to paint him as a bigot. I don't think he was any more bigoted than the average person of the day. And the average person of the day, yes, was bigoted. But I don't think he was remarkably prejudiced. In fact, I will give him credit for something that Katherine Jackson did not do. They both collected a ballad called Sir Hugh, which is basically a calumny set to music. It's a song about, it's the blood libel. It's the Jewish blood libel. It's based on the Prioress's tale from the Canterbury Tales about the evil Jewish woman who lures an innocent boy in and drains his blood for horrible purposes, you know. And Jackson did not pass comment on it at all. Cecil Sharp, in his introduction, pointed out that this was in fact blood libel and it had been used as an excuse to do horrible things to Jewish people for centuries. So score 1 for Cecil. But I will say that his musicological analysis is faulty, especially when it comes to this emphasis on the pentatonic scale. First of all, yes, the great majority of his ballads were pentatonic, but again, it's important to realize that he got 60 of those 300 from one person, from Jane Hicks Gentry, and the majority of hers were pentatonic. You take that out of the equation, and suddenly it's much more balanced between major and the other modes. Second of all, he was trying to make the case that because it was pentatonic, that was proof that they were displaced Elizabethan Englishmen because why Elizabethan Englishmen, this is ancient. This is the pentatonic scale could only be ancient in English, and it is poppycock. First of all, the pentatonic scale is the most widely used scale among folk musics in the world. It is in Hungarian music. It is in Chinese music. It is in Korean music. It is in a kind of music that he did not want to acknowledge, and which may account for the fact that the tunes to these Appalachian ballads that bear pretty much the same words are vastly different in Southern Appalachia than they are in England. And that group is African American, Western African to be exact. Pentatonic scales are huge in Western African music. They're also huge in Southeastern Native American music. And the fact is that the melodies to these songs are different in Appalachia than they are in England, in Scotland, and in the Northeast of the United States. I spent a whole summer crunching every collection that I could find, and that is the conclusion that I came to. So he stressed the pentatonic scale. Katherine Jackson, to be fair, a lot of her songs were also pentatonic, but the majority of them were in a straight major scale. Okay, some of you may not know what I'm talking about, right? Pentatonic is a 5-note scale, major scale is a 7-note scale. So if you sing the scale. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 is the same as 1, right? 1, 2, sing it with me. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Now we're going to do the same thing, but we are going to leave out 4 and we are going to leave out 7. So it will sound like 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 8. Try that. 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 8. Okay, that's the pentatonic scale. Widely in use in Appalachian music, not so much in the collections that Sharp cites, including his own dance collection, by the way. Sorry. Okay, yeah, that's going to stir up a hornet's nest. But anyway, that is a difference that I found. Katherine Jackson's ballads were primarily in a major key, just straight major key. I'll sing the first verse of one so you can hear it. It's got the entire major scale and just about the first phrase. And this one really feels like a later importation because it has that kind of hornpipe rhythm, according to what she notated. The first came in were lily white, and the next were pink and blue. The next came in Lord Vanner's wife, the flower of the view. Da dum da da dum. The first came in were lily white. 8, 8, 7, 6, 4, 3, 2, 1, 7, 2, 5. It's the entire major scale. Every note of the major scale is in that melody, in just the first phrase. So that's another difference musically. Why is this important? Because I can tell you, I'm one of the things I do at Berea is teach music education, and I'm in the schools a lot, so I see what materials they use. And some of the books still have in it. Cecil Sharp found that pentatonic, Appalachian music is all based on pentatonic scales, and this proves that these were songs that English people brought over a long time ago. Yeah, okay. Of course, there's also the fact that primarily the settlers of Appalachia were not just English, they were also Scots. They were Scots-Irish, to be exact. Displaced from Scotland, Northern Ireland, from Northern Ireland to Pennsylvania, from Pennsylvania down into Appalachia. And it is lost on some people in my country, but I'm sure that you know that Anglo-Saxon and Scot is not the same thing. It ain't the same thing. It's just not. I will also say that, Sharp was trying to find the same songs here that were being sung in England. And I don't think he was necessarily trying to prove that Appalachians were untainted Englishmen, Others did that for him. But, the fact of the matter is he missed a lot by being focused on just that one thing. And he also kind of grouped the Scots in with the English, which is kind of a curious thing to me. But in our country, this whole focus on the purity of the pure Anglo-Saxon heritage of Southern Appalachians was really being done for a pretty horrible purpose by William Goodell Frost, and some other people. I don't know if you would know them, Josiah Combs and Hubert Sheeran and a bunch of the early collectors. And the idea was that if you exalted white culture, you would do it as a way to put down other cultures. And the cultures that they were most afraid of at that time, it wasn't African American, it was the immigrants who were coming into the cities. As Frost called them, hyphenated Americans who are overrunning our cities. People like my grandfather, basically. It was really uncomfortable for me because I grew up, I'm not an Appalachian. I grew up in New Jersey. But my first album was a Gene Ritchie album. It was Chivalry. And I grew up thinking of Appalachian as the real American folk music. And when I came to study it and found out that the way that this music came to be defined as the real American folk music was as a device to exclude people, I was horrified. And I think that is a story that isn't told enough. So, and again, I'm not blaming Sharp for that, but he did he you know, he was collecting butterflies, so he collected butterflies and didn't note that there was a rare, you know, three-headed frog who sang Dixie, you know, because it just wasn't what he was looking for, you know. But it's our loss that he didn't do that, you know, and neither did Jackson. I mean, Jackson commented on a few banjo tunes that she heard, but she really did not elaborate very much. Okay, so those are the differences. Now we get to the other question: why wasn't it published? Well, this is the heart of my book, and I don't want to give the whole thing away because I want you all to buy it and read it. But I will tell you that it is a real tangle. It would be so easy to just blame William Goodell Frost and say, yeah, he was being a jerk, you know. The fact is, William Goodell Frost was a mite prickly. He was easily offended. He held grudges. That is beyond a doubt if you read correspondence from him and about him. But the fact is, there were other things that came to bear, factors that were part and parcel of the early Ballad Wars of the 21st century. It's not my phrase, it's Scott Spencer's phrase. And it had two phases. One was kind of a wonky ivory tower argument about where do ballads come from? You know, are they made up by single people, or do people get in a room and share and write them at the same time? It's the kind of argument that only academics in an ivory tower could have. I mean, have you ever sat down in a ballad circle? I mean, come on, you know. But they did, and they would like go to the wall for this argument. But the second phase of the Ballad War is what affected Jackson, and that was that people attached themselves to more powerful figures in the field of ballad study. And the big person in the field at that time was George Lyman Kittredge, who succeeded Francis Child at Harvard and was editor of the Journal of American Folklore. And some people were connected to this guy, and some people were not connected to this guy. And Katherine Jackson French was not connected to this guy. And that played against her. And in the meanwhile, other people started publishing more and more about Appalachian balladry, culminating with Cecil Sharp in 1917. And so Jackson didn't really she wasn't the sole authority anymore. And I think that kind of cooled Frost's interest. There's also some really uncomfortable stuff, like in the meantime, while that collection was sitting at Berea, Frost let other people in to see it. That's a no-no in academia. I don't think he would have done that with any of the male collectors at Berea. In fact, some of her songs found their way into their collections. This is really uncomfortable, okay? But it is true. And also, she got married, she had a child, and in 1917, they moved, first to Detroit, and then they moved to Louisiana. So the big question, would it have made a difference? And I give you an emphatic yes and no. How's that for definitive? Here's why. Her view was certainly different. She highlighted women to an extent that really, the only other person who did this was Emma Bell Miles in her beautiful book, The Spirit of Mountains, 1905. I don't know if you know about her. She was a mountain woman herself, but she was cultured and educated. She married a mountain man. She drew, she painted, she knew music. And the book has some Appalachian songs transcribed by her in it, has some of her artwork in it. It's a lovely book. And she talks a lot about how it's women who were singing these songs. But that book didn't really gain any traction. She wasn't an academic. She was just a woman, you know, in Appalachia writing some stuff. So Jackson's highlighting the role of women was important. And those who were paying attention would have seen it perhaps, and it would have been part of the conversation. But the fact is, Sharp had a very big reputation by then, and he was a man. And so I think the odds are he might have outshone her anyway, but this at least would have been out there for the past 100 years. This would have been there for somebody else to find before I came along 100 years later. So at any rate, she did not publish. The ballad collection did not see the light of day, and time passed. And more time passed, and more time passed, and this is the part of the story we did not know. A woman named Elizabeth Peck became college historian at Berea College, and she went into the mountain room where she said all things were kept. And she came across a package tied with tough knots with a note on it that said, K. Jackson, hold, in the handwriting of William Goodell Frost, who I knew so well. Taking advantage of my new position as historian, I undid the tough knots. And in that package were the ballads of Katherine Jackson French. The year was 1954. It had been 44 years since Katherine Jackson first approached Berea for help. Well, it has somewhat of a happy ending because Elizabeth Peck contacted Gladys Jameson at the music department, and they found out who she was. They invited her to Berea. They used one of her songs in the Centennial Outdoor Extravaganza, Wilderness Road, and they started the Katherine Jackson French collection, which, as you know by now, is where I met her. So that is the ballad collecting chapter of her life. As I said, she had a remarkable second act, married, founded a women's department club in Shreveport, Centenary College professor, head of the Louisiana AAUW. She single-handedly kept it going through World War II. And when she died, all of Shreveport mourned. There are 3 boxes of these letters that were sent to her daughter from Shreveport. She is buried in London, Kentucky, a mile from where she grew up. And I would like to just close by reading a little bit about the end of her life, just 2 paragraphs from the book. The opening page of the service book for French's funeral reads, "If life is sacred, it should not be allowed to perish. We are not dead until we are forgotten." Sadly, Katherine Jackson French has indeed been forgotten. Traces of her are impossible to find in her birthplace. No one there remembers any mention of her. Only a few echoes linger in Shreveport. There is no mention of her at Centenary College, no statue, no plaque, no marker. There are no markers to her at the Shreveport First United Methodist Church, though she taught Sunday school there for 31 years. Streets bear the names of other founders of the Women's Department Club, but the only monument to her is the lonely plaque that hangs in the back of the auditorium of the Shreveport Women's Department Club, thanking her for sharing her gifts and changing the lives of thousands of women. This remarkable pioneer, the first collector, male or female, to attempt to publish a large scholarly collection of Southern Appalachian ballads, a mover and shaker in the Louisiana AAUW, the co-founder of the Shreveport Women's Department Club, a beloved professor at Centenary College, and a proud daughter of London, Kentucky, has been consigned to obscurity by the passing of years and a seemingly willful ignorance on the part of her time and ours regarding the accomplishments of such women. That her feats have largely been ignored or forgotten makes them no less glorious. She was a giant, and like many other forgotten giants, she paved the way for other women who followed, breaking down walls that might still be in place without her efforts. Indeed, honor is her due, and hers is a name worthy of remembrance.
Okay. Thank you so much for your talk, Professor DiSavino. That was very interesting. I certainly didn't know the vast majority of what you talked about. And we now have some time for some questions if anybody has some.
Lovely.
Yeah, feel free to use the raise hand feature on Zoom, and Dan, my moderator, will take note of the order those pop up in. Or if you want us to read out a question on your behalf, type it in the chat and then I can read it out for Professor DiSavino. I have a few that I can use to get us started if anyone is still. Oh, Vic, there we go. So yeah, everyone, you should be able to unmute yourselves from what I gather of the settings on Zoom.
Right. Are you hearing me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, no, I think you've done a lovely job in unearthing a pioneer collector. I mean, I look at this from an English angle, and you know, there are similar figures in this country. Frank Kidson, who published his traditional tunes in 1891, self-published it. It's a wonderful pioneering collection. He knew more about the history of popular song and popular music than anybody. I mean, Sharp. I mean, I'm largely in agreement with your assessment of Sharp, and the thing is that Sharp, he wanted these mythical aspects to be true. He wanted this Anglo-Saxon, Elizabethan sort of pure peasant to be still existing in Appalachia. The thing about Sharp is that he was so energetic. I mean, once he got the bit between his teeth, it took him some time. He didn't really get going till 1903. And, he then amasses this, 5,000 pieces in his collection. I think it's 1,500 in the Appalachian collection. He really devoted himself, and he was a proselytizer. He was a real, he gave lecture upon lecture, and this was the way, this was. Now, I think you've done a tremendous job. All I'd say is quite a lot of the criticisms of Sharp, of a similar type have been made from this end over the past really since the 1970s, 80s, when we've begun to see a lot of the limitations, but the success of his view of how the thing was is amazing. And of course, it was carried on by Maud Carpellease, who inherited his sort of mantle and his way in which the ideas were correct, and he wouldn't broach. Even contemporaries were criticising Sharp and saying there were things wrong. And certainly in terms of the breadth of the repertory, I think you're absolutely right. Just one point on the musical stuff. I've done some stuff on Sharp's transcribing abilities, and he was pretty good. He was pretty good when the tunes were straightforward. He really gets into difficulty. The way I've done it is with the very, very few sound recordings we have of some of the singers he contacted. And when the stuff was easy, my transcriptions came out the same as Sharp's pretty much. When they were difficult, he would do a little fragment of them or some sort of representation of them. And he would interfere with the stuff. He would edit the stuff and make it presentable and so on. I could say more, but I think I've said enough.
No, that's fascinating, actually. Yeah. It's a funny thing. I've been reading, there's a fellow who teaches at ETSU, Eastern Tennessee State University, named Phil Jameson, who's a dance expert. And he said, what struck me was that he noted that Sharp was at Pine Mountain Settlement School and saw a move that had no corollary in English dance. So he said, it must be a more ancient English move. Instead of saying maybe somebody invented it here or borrowed it, or maybe they just messed something up, No, it must be an older. So he did the same thing apparently with dance that he did with music, which was,
he just reinvented. He did his first edition of the country dance book is traditional dances, but he found them boring. And so he went back to Playford and just invented a whole set of practices, which, it's a classic example of the invention of tradition.
By the way, I analyzed 2 volumes of Playford. You know how many tunes were pentatonic?
Not many, I would think.
0. Not one. Yeah, maybe in some of the other volumes, but this is what I could access online.
Just one point on some of his best English singers were women. He does recognise this. Mrs. O'Verge from Somerset and people like that. He does say what remarkable singers they are. And he made great friends with a couple of sisters. I'm getting old and the names come slowly, but he did recognise the musicality of some women. But I think he was a man of his time. So
yes, very much so. Yeah. Well, yeah, it's funny. Man of his times. Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Steve Roud pointed out that, Cecil Sharp was not necessarily trying to define Appalachia for future generations. He was just collecting songs. And he was collecting songs, but he did have this preset concept of what he was seeing. And rather than saying, well, this is similar and this is similar, so obviously there's some kind of similar heritage there, it had to be all or nothing, but it wasn't all or nothing. What we're finding out more and more in Appalachian music is that, there were a great many influences that have not been examined until now. There's African-American string band influence is getting a lot of print thanks to Rhiannon Giddens, and others. But there are other threads that haven't even been pulled. I don't think the Native American thread has been pulled.
One of the interesting things is that I mean, I do think your preconceptions do affect the way you transcribe. I mean, transcribing to me is a bit like doing a sketch of something, and different people would do different sketches of the same thing. There is no 5-time recorded in English traditional song until Sharp. I think it's genuine, but you know, he sort of sees it and hears it. Again, I tried to do transcriptions which show that, but there's nothing recorded in the Journal of Folk Song Society in 5-time really until Sharp comes along. You know, this perception of the collector is really important.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you for that.
Welcome.
Any other questions?
I'm curious about the people who are here. I mean, how many? Could we kind of go around and just get a sense of who's conducting research right now, and whether you're working on doctorates or books, or whether you're just interested? I'm just curious who we're talking to, because I'm wondering if, you know, I mean, I could tell you some stuff about publishing or about the writing process or something if it's helpful, but I'm just curious who we're talking to.
Yeah.
So how many are currently working on a doctorate, a thesis, or a book?
Well, I've been, okay. I'm sorry.
Okay, go ahead.
I'm Marge Steiner. I've been doing folk song work for 40 years, both in Northern Ireland and in Canada. So I've been working with materials for years, but I also had a question about your work. And Sharp obviously made a lot of pronouncements that we take issue with now. I mean, that of course, most of what he got was more Scots-Irish than English, but to what extent did Katherine Jackson French, I'm sorry, did she actually write essays or do any kind of analysis, or did she just jot down ballads? Did she have any theoretical conceptions, and to what extent did she have any kind of pronouncements about things?
She did not do any kind of musicological analysis, none at all that I could find. She did think that these were Anglo-Saxon and Scottish ballads. I mean, her collection is called English-Scottish Ballads from the Hills of Kentucky, and she's a Jackson and a McPhee. Okay.
Right. So she at least recognized the Scottish, if not the Scots-Irish.
Yeah, absolutely, she did. And she did do some writing later. She wrote a really lovely article when Berea recontacted her. She wrote an article for Mountain Life and Work entitled A Fortnight of Balladry, that was published as A Fortnight in Ballad Country. And in it, she describes Sister Marthy's sons. And she does mention them briefly in her other introduction, but what she says is that they're playing fiddlestick style on the banjo. And what that means is they're taking knitting needles, and one is fingering and the other is whacking the strings, which is done on the fiddle. That's why it's called fiddlesticks.
Right, yeah.
But it's a Jamaican import. It originated in Jamaica. So how did it get from Jamaica to, there's a great story there somewhere, who knows what it was, but these kids are playing fiddlestick style on the banjo.
So and did she work?
She could tell the tune. So
did she work with African American informants? I mean, I guess Sharp's contact with African Americans was minimal, although I guess there was some.
Yeah, it was. He had one, as he put it, mixed race woman.
Right.
Who was a laundry woman who sang for him. I can't remember her name. But he had the normal prejudices of the time, you know. I mean, he and Carpelese both.
But what about Katherine?
She did not mention Black people in one way or another. She did not mention other races in one way or another. I will tell you, and this is an interesting thing, because I was really bothered by this whole thing that she put little Hugh, the Jew's daughter, in, and she didn't. I was really troubled by that because, but you know, I mean, you have to be objective and you have to say the bad with the good. And the fact is she had no
Of
comment,
course.
pushed it without
Yeah.
comment.
Yeah.
But later in her life, when she taught at Centenary in the 1930s, her best friend was a Jewish escapee from Nazi Germany who taught
Wow.
history there. And they
Mhm.
were always together. They had lunch together every day. You know, he was over to the house. And I really wonder what her journey was on that. I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall. But yeah. So I mean, and I'll say again, I don't think Sharp was more or less prejudiced than anybody of his day.
Yeah.
Prejudice was not only accepted, it was expected.
Yeah.
It was
Well,
expected.
you know, you look at,
It was expected. You know, I mean, it's the awakening to how wrong and how harmful, you know, racist attitudes, racist jokes, racist exclusion is it was lost on my generation. Even lost on my father, who, as an Italian American, couldn't buy land in certain places in our town in the 1950s.
wow.
Because it was
Wow.
last one
Yeah.
in and close the door, which is
Yeah.
sadly true of my Italian side of the heritage spectrum.
But you look at people like Bascom Lamar Lunsford, who
Mhm.
had very unfortunate attitudes, and also the founders of well, there was John Powell. There was the
White
whole
Top
White
Festival.
Top Folk Festival.
It was White Top,
and
all
it was-
right. Boy, was it white.
Yeah, White Top. Yeah, in more ways than one.
Yeah.
And you know, so very, very unfortunate.
Yeah, I agree.
Yep.
Yeah, did we want to get back to the sort of polling to see who was here, or do we want to sort of carry on with some questions?
I'm fine with questions if you like.
Okay.
But anyway, my folk song work is continuing. I'm working on books. I've got stuff in the Canadian the archives of what's it called? Canadian Museum of Civilization, now Canadian Museum of
fantastic.
National History, and
Great.
my Irish stuff is finally going into the archives of traditional music here at Indiana University. So I have lots of stuff.
Well, congratulations. That's great. Tell me your
Yep.
name again, Marge.
Oh, Marge or Margaret Steiner, Steiner.
Thank you. Yeah, well,
Sure.
I'll keep an eye out for your work then. Thank you.
Okay, great.
Yeah, back to Vic then, it looks like. You're muted, Vic, sorry.
Sorry. Just make a little point about Little Sir Hugh, which he does publish it and he does make that, you know, point, but he publishes it in a piano setting so that you can perform it. This
Yeah,
is
I know.
and that it is the blood libel, but also Bishop Percy, going back to the relics, he makes a similar point to, you know, he denounces it as the blood libel, but again goes on to publish it. I mean, interestingly, I looked at this some time ago. Interestingly, I mean, it is a very well-made ballad. It's, you know, for all its evil content, it's actually crafted very well.
It's
And
hard.
I think there's a contradiction there, you know.
It's hard to not cry when you sing it and you get to the end. And the last line is,
I couldn't sing it now. I could not sing it now.
yeah.
And I don't understand people who can, because not
Well-
after the Holocaust, not after,
yeah.
you know, hundreds of years of Jewish persecution.
I would never just sing it. What I did sing it at the Appalachian Studies Association conference in context. And what I did was give the entire background, and just as I explained it to you, you know, that it is a blood libel, and that I found it troubling. But, you know, I think you have to present the good with the bad. And I mean, I think it's important to know about these things, because if we don't know about these things, it's easy to pretend that they didn't happen, you know, and it's easy to culturally erase horrible chapters of our history, you know. And as I said, you know, these ballads are windows into race and class structure and gender and everything else. And often they are bloody windows. They are very bloody windows. So.
Yep, and question from David by the looks of it. You're muted, David, sorry.
job I was muted when I responded to the fact that I was muted. Hear what I said. I haven't entirely got a handle on the extent of Katherine Jackson French's collection, and for instance, how much was she constrained by the idea of the child ballads? I mean, one reason why all those people were writing down Sir Hugh is that it was a child ballad, and it's in the child ballads because it relates to the story of Hugh of Lincoln, which goes back to 1215 or whatever it is. So child thought it was ancient and therefore worthy of recording. I mean, the ballad's probably nothing like as old, but there you go. So yeah, just an idea of the range of her collection, I suppose.
Yeah. Okay. Let's look at that. Yes, I wouldn't say she was constrained by Child, but she was looking for the same ballads that Child had collected. Yes, and she was actually the first to collect Sir Hugh in America. She was the first to do that. And when she listed her ballads, just as Sharp did, it was Child number 10, Child number 25, and then listing other Percy or, Scott's musical manuscript or whatever. She would always list everybody else after Child. And so when I published the collection, I did the same thing because, and I put them in the same order as Child's ballads. I mean, she didn't have as many as Child had, obviously, but I put them in the same order because that was her intent. And yes, she was looking for those same, for the same group of ballads that Sharp did. And she also was, she was a believer in English literature. She really loved English literature. That was her thing. And she saw these ballads as being a kind of literature. So that was one of the things that lit her fire. But, let's call it what it is. She also talked a lot about, pure heritage and Anglo-Saxon and Scottish heritage, and that these are proof of longevity for a long period of yesterdays, and kind of propping up that idea that if something lasted this long, and then it must be proof of a superior civilization. So she had, her approach was, it had some things in common with Sharp. It lacked the false musicological analysis and ideology, but she was in line with the idea that these were English ballads. She didn't question whether or not the tunes were the same or different, because in the first place, Sharp didn't. Sharp collected tunes, but Child did not. So if you wanted to collect to the if you wanted to compare to English versions, you had to compare to some of the other collections. And that wasn't her thing. She was mostly interested. She did transcribe herself. She did transcribe the melodies, but she was mostly interested, I think, in the lyrics.
Sure. Strictly speaking, Child didn't collect anything.
Right. No, he compiled. He was a compiler, basically.
But that's where the idea that all this stuff is ancient comes from, and that comes down to the present day. And there's no shame in putting the child ballads first in your collection. Everybody does it, but of course it's perpetuated a myth of the ancientness of certain ballads, which is largely nonsensical. And of the 305, there's probably about 20 that are worth listening to.
I actually love them, so I wouldn't, for me, I wouldn't say that.
Not all 305, you can't possibly. I bet you don't sing Old Matrons on a regular basis.
No, I can't say that I do. No, definitely not. I think Derek has his hand up.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it looks like Derek has a question. So,
David just beat me to it to say that Child wasn't a collector but a collator. But you've mentioned her literary background, but what was her musical background? What was her musical training? After all, Sharp was a music teacher and a music scholar.
Yeah. Well, she grew up at a time where cultured young women took piano lessons. And I couldn't find a record of whether she did or whether she didn't, but her sister certainly did, because Mamie Jackson became a composer, had a work played by the Los Angeles Philharmonic late in life. What I did find, I found several things to suggest that Katherine Jackson had also had piano lessons. In the first place, she passed out of all of her music classes from Science Hill on, right through Ohio Wesleyan. So she had some kind of musical training. And in the second place, when they moved into a house in Shreveport, her diary noted that there were several piano manuscript books that she planned to keep and use. And beyond that, she played organ in church from time to time. So she was definitely a keyboard player with some kind of musical training, and enough musical training that she could transcribe the songs that she heard. So that was what I was able to put together.
Okay. Just also, to what extent was she sort of steered round to particular singers by by
Lysane?
By her companion?
Entirely. Entirely. And that's one of the cool things, is that you really get this sense that this was a communal thing. Singing ballads was just communal. It wasn't like, and now we're going to be quiet while Lysane sings. No, I mean, they'd be sewing and doing things, and they'd just start up a song, and if people knew it, they'd sing along. You know, it doesn't matter if it's 20 verses, they sing along. You know, if it had a chorus, they'd sing the chorus. And I think, you know, I've thought about this, and I wonder if one reason why you got more of a sense of the communal nature of ballad singing from Katherine than you did from Sharp was because she was a woman and he was a man. And women at that day and age and place there were acceptable spaces. And within those spaces, there was acceptable behavior, right? So the acceptable spaces for women in Appalachia at the time were the home, the church, the school. That's it. Those were the public places. And so even within those, there were certain hierarchies of behavior. Like, you know, if the man had something to say, you were quiet. And if the men weren't there and you had a bunch of women over, well, then you might talk and sing and be more verbose, and there'd be a different hierarchy in place, right? Usually headed by the older women. So I really wonder if the reason her experience was different than Sharp's was in part because she herself was a woman being taken around by a female member of the community. Also, I think it's important to note, you know, she was in Kentucky. Cecil Sharp, for his 1917 collection, did not collect in Kentucky at all. The only Kentucky songs came from Olive Dame Campbell's prior trips. Later on, 1917, he did collect in Kentucky. A great many of those songs found their way into the 1932 version. But for the 1917 version, there were no Kentucky songs collected by Cecil Sharp. And I think it's also really important to realize that, you know, Appalachia, yes, it was settled by the Scots-Irish who came down the spine of Appalachia. It was also settled by the English settlers on the coast who pushed west. And the English ballad tradition and the Scottish ballad tradition are not identical. And the styles of singing are certainly not identical. And so I wonder if some of the differences in styles of ballad singing in Appalachia from place to place, and there are differences, they are not all the same. I wonder if they're tied to the fact that there were different groups in different places. You know, in Kentucky, they hardly ever do that break that you hear from like Sheila K. Adams. In Scarlet Town, where I was born. I'm exaggerating, but that break, that crack, that yelp, it doesn't exist in Kentucky ballad singing. You know, I've listened to the oldest recordings that I can find. It's not there. So why? You know, is it because this was mostly Scottish and maybe Western Carolina, the Headright Act came in and the English moved west? I don't know. But I mean, there's a doctoral study for somebody. Go to it.
Yeah, any more questions for anybody? Or just comments or, you know, recommendations? Yeah, Vic again?
Well, I'll just pick up that difference between the Scots and the English. I don't think it's so great. There's a difference in language, certainly. If you look at what surprised me when I first looked in Gavin Gregg's collection, you know, which is a wonderful collection from Aberdeenshire, from about, you know, just a few parishes around New Deer in Aberdeenshire. was how many Southern English songs there were. I was very used to Southern English songs. I knew about them. Loads of them in Aberdeenshire. I got a record recently of singers in West Clare. Loads of what I would call English songs.
Sure.
I don't. I'm also worried. I mean, I don't think you used it particularly, but this whole idea of Celtic and the Scots-Irish. I mean, yes, Scots-Irish and Scots from particularly the southeast of Scotland, southwest of Scotland went to, but so did people from the north of England, Cumberland, Northumberland, where I live. Lancashire, I mean, a lot of those people went to the Appalachians, and
They did, but here are the statistics. From 1710 to 1800, 250,000 people from Northern Ireland came to America. 225,000 of them were Scots-Irish. 25,000 of them were English. So it was predominantly Scots. However, I was talking more about the singing style rather than the repertoire. I think the repertoire is greatly shared. But I don't know. I mean, and I haven't really studied this. I'm talking off the top of my head, and you might know more about it than I do. But, you know, I hear more of a head voice and more of a lightness and more of an agility with lots of little ornaments and frills and pipe crans and things in the vocal style of the Scottish, especially the Highlanders, which have a whole different story in America.
Yeah, that's the difference. The difference is, I think, between southern Scotland and the Highlands. That's the big musical difference.
Yes, that is a difference.
I think the southern Scotland has a lot more to do with, you know, I live right on the border almost, and you know, I mean, it was the traffic between this part of the world and Scotland was just constant. People worked in Scotland, they came back. They worked in Scotland, they came back. You know, I mean, it's an interesting point, but I do feel, I don't know. I mean, I'd like to know more about the numbers of the, you know, you're throwing a big number at me there, but there's also, I've seen evidence of people from, you know, Cumberland, Westmoreland, Northumberland, Lancashire going to Appalachia.
Oh, I'm not saying they didn't. I'm not saying they didn't. And I'll say again, I think a great many came west from North Carolina and Virginia. Because they were having things like the Head Right Act, where they would give land away because they wanted a buffer between civilization and the Native Americans, you know. Yeah. And so a great many of the English and a little bit later the Highland Scots, they moved west into North Carolina.
Is there a good source on this? I'd really like to read more about this, actually.
Well, you know, Doug Orr talks a little bit about it in Wayfaring Strangers, which is a fun.
But I don't think that's a very reliable book, personally.
I was going to say some things he doesn't get right. However, he does cite the demographics on that. Got that from.
I've tried to look for the demographics in more detail, and
yeah.
You know, it's I mean, I'm not trying to deny Sharp's nationalism.
No. But you know, my major point is, and I think you're right. I think there's a lot of cultural exchange along the border that went on, and then there was more cultural exchange between English, Irish, and Scottish in Northern Ireland for the couple of generations they were there. You know, Northern Irish music is not the same as Scottish music, and is not the same as English music, and so it kind of became its own creature. And that is largely what came to the Appalachians. But my point is, it's not only what was in the Appalachians. These settlers who were here from the 1600s on had their traditions, and they moved west as well. And so I'm wondering if that plays into the difference between styles. I don't know. That's a question. That's not a determination.
No, it's an interesting question. We don't know all the answers by any means. If you want to hear some great decorated English singing, find the Percy Grainger recordings of Joseph Taylor of Saxby All Saints. They are just
yeah, amazing. Yeah,
1906, I think they were made, and they are just wonderful. I think they're on the British Library website now.
If you could write that in the chat, Vic, that would be really helpful. I'm sure lots of people are interested.
It's a terrible, clunky website, and I'm not sure, so I don't want to commit myself. But
I know that University of Birmingham, which is where I'm based, has a big Percy Grainger collection, but I don't know that much is digitized. I think probably British Library would be the best bet.
Oh, that's lovely. That's great.
But you see, you know, the number of Irish people in England is amazing. I mean, they've been coming here since, you know, since the Middle Ages, and particularly in the 19th century, and the influence, you know, the culturally, I mean, I think it's much more about cultural exchange than it ever is about, you know, English music and Scottish music and so on, you know.
Yeah.
And I think that's where Black, you know, African Americans come in, because I think there's a hell of a chunk of, I mean, your point about pentasonicism in West African music is spot on. And, you know, I think that you know, when these traditions are close enough to sort of really meld together and form some synthesis, that's what happens, you know.
Yeah.
And the ideas of purity are just rubbish, you know.
Yeah. Well, you know, intersectionality is one of the things that I'm really fascinated by, and it's, in fact, that's kind of where my next course of study is taking me. But yeah, I mean, the more the more threads you pull, the more you find out that those threads are connected to other threads, and eventually you have a web where everything is somehow connected. You know,
Yeah.
It's not to say that there's not differences, but you do find that as the wheels spoke out, you know, everything touches everything else. That's fascinating.
Good.
Yeah, that's a really great point to end on. Everything's connected. Thank you everybody for coming and for your really interesting questions. And if you have anything further, I'm sure Professor DiSavino would take an email, you know, that I think your email address is on your staff page. So
absolutely. I guess I should say if you're interested in the book, you can get it online from just about anybody, Amazon or whatever. And if you're interested in the songbook or the recording, you can email me. Probably the easiest thing is email me at Berea College. I'm the only Elizabeth DiSavino on the faculty, I assure you.
I've got the info here, just pasted in.
Okay, lovely.
I prepared that and then I remembered I had it written down. But
yeah, and I'll give you my Berea email, because that's the easiest email I have to remember. DiSavino, whoops, not capital. DiSavino E at Berea. Whoops, I can't find the at berea.edu. There it is.
But yeah, thank you everybody for coming. And this, as I said at the beginning, has been recorded. So if there was anything you missed or you want to go back and type up the name something, it will be on the MIDSPOP website in the coming weeks. I can't give you a specific date, but it'll be up in a few weeks. And yeah, thank you everybody for coming and have a good rest of your evening.
Thank you so much.